done a MRCP and Heber's MRCP. It's possibly the type 4/3B benign restricture. We had done a hypertension in 2005. Was already for 10 years. Came back to us about 6 months back, 3 months back with episodic pain, fever and chills. What MRCP done shows you some dilation of the pituitary system. Other frames also show you some stones in the proximal ducts. So we got a P2PD done. P2PD shows complete cutoff at the anastomosis. The anatomy is still about type 4. Got a CT done to evaluate what is going on. And the right lobe seems to have shrunken somewhat, still not fitting the definition of atrophy, but I guess less than 50% is atrophy, so it is less than 50%. Right artery is intact. So these are kind of patients which set you thinking, you done an excellent job, technically fine, why did it stricture? And it does happen. We know that large number of stricture in the first few years, but there are patients who keep coming back to you after years of follow-up. And point to be considered when endoscopists tell you that we have good results of endoscopic treatment. Because surgeons still find it difficult to give you excellent results after 10, 20 years of follow-up. So why does adjust stricture? The most important factors are still technical and non-evaluable. Because when the patient comes back to you with a recurrent hepatic pneumonia stricture, you won't have this information most of the time. How was the anastomosis done? And this actually is the most important information as far as the restricture goes. It should have been a large anastomosis, mucosa well vascularized, tension-free, and done by an experienced surgeon. And these are factors we actually concentrate on, which are mostly non-modifiable. Early repair, we had talked about it in the last presentation, so I am not going to repeat that all that again. So if you do early repair in non-selective patients, you will get bad results in the follow-up. Arterial injury, external biliary fistula, high complex strictures and previous repair, all factors predictive of hepatic venostomy strictures in the long run. Let's talk about biliovascular injuries for some time. Next couple of slides deal with that. It seems to be a catastrophic event when the patient comes back to the bile duct injury and the angiogram or any other investigation, CT for example, shows you a right hepatic duct occlusion. It seems that people have done cadaveric studies in patients who underwent cholecystectomies, and it is not unusual to find right hepatic artery occluded altogether, and the patient actually died of something else. Which means that it happens much more commonly than we as surgeons like to believe. And it can happen without the bile duct injury. Why? Because it is part of the Calvert's triangle and it is easily possible to clip it and not have any problems. What is the incidence? Well, it's a very widely varied incidence, varying from about 10% to nearly 50%. Why is that so? Well, this is the reason. The series which do selective angiography. Patients have a problem, they do angiography, others get away, do a hepatic venostomy and go home. Will report a very low incidence. That is around 1%. And series who do routine angiography will find it much more common. Does it mean it causes problems all the while? Actually, possibly, real incidence is around 20%. A conjecture. The reason for that is series which are giving you a 10% figure are probably underestimating the incidence, and series which are giving you a 50% incidence are possibly giving you a referral bias because they were managing very complex and severe bile duct injuries. Why should arterial injury affect outcome of injury? Let's see a bit of anatomy. The arterial supply, I encourage the postgraduates to read the articles by Turner and Northover and several articles on the arterial supply of the bile duct. Give you an idea that most of the arterial supply comes from the right hepatic artery and from the gastroduodenal artery or its branches. And most of it runs parallel to the bile duct at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And in recent years, we came to know there is something called the marginal artery on top of the hilum, which communicates between the right and the left system and gives you a epi and pericortical plexus like this. You can imagine if I cut off the bile duct in the middle of it, then most of the perfusion coming from below is stopped. And therefore, the end of the bile duct that you get to repair is sometimes ischemic. No wonder that's called stenosis. What is the evidence that it will stenose? That again get to the area of controversy. Large number of series, incidence of recurrent biliary stricture following repair. These are the series which give you a bad result. And these are the series which say arterial injury made no difference to their outcome. So what is the real truth? This is the real truth. The series which were giving you good results, the artery was well vascularized from the opposite side. Even if the right hepatic artery was completely occluded. And that is why it made no difference whether you did a cardiogenostomy or sorry, it made no difference to the restricture rate of the cardiogenostomy. When you have a hepatic artery injury, right, hepatic artery injury, patient can present and have outcome in some of these ways. Results to you early, some of these patients will actually give you features of hepatic dysfunction. Markedly deranged transaminases, sometimes the imaging shows you ischemic right lobe, abscesses, infarction of the right lobe. Possible outcome may be liver resection. Very few of the patients actually get a liver resection, which tell you a majority of the right hepatic artery injuries don't present in the acute phase. If there is no major dysfunction or flow defect, it is wise possibly to not do a repair in the acute setting. That gives time for the collateralization to develop and the ischemic bile duct to become vascularized again. And so, if there is in the late presentation, patient can be present lobar atrophy, in which case you consider liver resection and then hepatogenostomy to the remnant. And there is no lobar atrophy, then angio will most of the bile duct injury. In terms of high biliary stricture affecting the outcome, but it sounds common sense to say that as the biliary stricture climbs up in the hilum, the loss will be the results. It seems so by this series. But is this entire truth? This is a series from Johns Hopkins 15 years back. This is not to confuse the postgraduates, but this is the real truth. The outcome of a hepatogenostomy, restricture or long-term outcome is so multifactorial that you cannot put your finger on one figure and say, this patient will have a restriction and this will not. And this is what the series lists. None of these factors came out of the significant in bulk bearing analysis. Which does not mean that the right hepatic artery injury is acceptable. What it means is, the restricture rate of hepatogenostomy is multifactorial. So one factor may compensate the other factor and two factors may make it worse. Again, for the postgraduates, I would like you to be aware of this grade because it is asked, once you've done a hepatogenostomy, how do you follow up the results? Monica McDonald was from Mayo Rochester and she gave this series of outcomes. It seems quite simple, common sense, but it is used world over in most institutions to follow up and give you results of hepatogenostomy. Grade A and B are excellent results and grade C and D are non-acceptable or considered to be bad results. How do they present? They present with the altered LFT to begin with, which is initially intermittent, then the changes become progressive. Repeated episodes of bronchitis, pain, fever, and in the very late phase, you miss the bus, the patient comes to report lab attention. What is the timing of failure? Most of them will fail within the first 2 to 3 years. And the remaining continue to fail over the next 10 years, possibly longer. We still don't know. But our longest results are 10 to 15 years and patients are still failing at that point in time. Look at the series from our own data for patients who failed hepatogenostomy, which means that these are all patients who had a recurrent stricture following hepatogenostomy. And till about 10 years, they are still failing. Which means, the only thing is that they all fail, or a majority of them fail in the first few years. So again, a point to be considered when you evaluate the result of endoscopic treatment, they fail till very long. So when you see excellent results of endoscopic treatment, the first 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, it still doesn't give you complete picture. Early failures are mostly considered to be technical failures. And late failures are mostly based on patient-related factors, like hepatic artery injury or other factors like inflammation. So what do you do? Standard management, as you would do when a patient who comes to me with a primary visit with a bile duct injury. That is, you take a history, you do LFT, vital scan, ultrasound, evaluate anatomy all over again. And in this particular case, you also start looking for arterial injury, if you haven't done so earlier. Which means you do a contrast or a contrast as well. In the treatment, well, you want to re-establish flow across the anastomosis, take care of stones which are a problem. When they come to you with long-standing strictures, they do have stones proximal to the stricture. And you want to make the patient free from the source of cholangitis, because that's what the patient came to you for. Not for anything else, he didn't come to you for atrophy. He came to you because he had cholangitis. Options, well, majority of the treatment options are only two, that is redo, with or without liver resection, or a percutaneous cavitation of the anastomosis. As a side event, when there are reports of enteroscopic cavitation of the biliary stricture or access coming through the stomach which has been used to dilate the restructure or restructure the hepatic endoscopy. I guess for this audience I will limit that to these two options only. Redo hepatic endoscopy. Done one, comes back after this stricture. Can you do again? And if you do that, what are the results? It seems in expert centers, the results are fairly good. On our own results, 26 patients with redo hepatic endoscopy, 94% success rate, one series 90% success rate, and the same place with other centers in the world, but only tertiary care high volume centers. Continue with balloon dilation as an option. Well, in effect, what you do is take a PDB axis, balloon pass, aim is to obliterate the waist. I think the radiologist already do this program, you just run through it, leave catheters across the anastomosis. Patency is checked by either a clinical trial or professional manometry, and then on follow-up, and we need time to take it out. What are the results? That's where the radiologist will not give it data. One of the largest series in literature today. And 10-year follow-up gives you best results of 60%. And this is the largest series of percutaneous balloon dilatation of hepatic endoscopy strictures in literature. And when surgeons tell you I can give you 90% results, you still want to accept 60% results. It's not to condemn that this is no option. It is a complementary game. You want to use both options. But how do you choose? Well, again, literature really doesn't help you. From the same series, they try to evaluate features which predict success in percutaneous balloon dilation. Couldn't find any. All those factors, high, low strictures, artery injuries, atrophy, etc., couldn't find any. So we are nowhere. So how do I choose when I get a redo stricture? Do I operate? Do I do balloon dilation? It's still based on hearsay, I guess, or because I say so in most experienced hands. But this makes common sense. You have a good risk patient, only do is better. So what is good risk? You have a low stricture, 1, 2 or 3, 3A preferably, good general condition, only 1 hour previous repair or maybe 2 repairs, done by a non-specialist surgeon. So the primary surgeon who had caused injury and done a repair, most likely you can still do it and get a decent result. This is what most of the patients we presented just now, a few slides back, based on. Bad risk, send them to a radiologist because they will be stricture anyway, you won't get the blame for it. High strictures, cirrhosis, poor lung condition, already 2 repairs done, failed. These are patients, previous repair done by you yourself. Most of these patients will go to this balloon dilator. Should you do liver section? Patients who have a lobar atrophy, who have hepatic metastasis in one lobe predominantly, stricture extending to the secondary confluence, considered unrepairable. You have right ducts, 2, 3 ducts which are the right system, you can't repair it. You possibly do good with the liver section. To summarize, HS stricture can be because of a technical fault or patient-related factors. Detailed assessment is required. A redo HJ is good by experienced team in selected patients. The bad-risk patients go to balloon dilation. Both modalities are not seem to be competing but complementary to each other. Thank you.
I know we all know that biliary injuries have a biliary injuries are a devastating complication. The disturbing fact is that even after 2 decades of the use of laparoscopic procedures, the incidence continues to be almost 2 times that of open procedures. Good thing about these biliary injury repairs is that in more than 85% of the cases where the repair is done in expert hands in tertiary care centers, there is no further intervention required. However, there are a subset of subjects who would require multiple procedures as well as surgery. Therefore, there is considerable morbidity and occasional necessity of liver transplant, as Rajneesh had emphasized, and there is a definite mortality associated with biliary injuries. So, what are the consequences of biliary injury and its repair? There is a significant long-term morbidity, disability, and healthcare utilization. There is litigation, and definitely there is cost involved. What happens to the patient who undergo repair? They are sentenced to lifetime of blood tests, radiographic studies, and multiple surgical procedures. When we talk of quality of life in these patients, we talk of health. And by WHO criteria, health is not limited only to the absence of disease or infirmity, but encompasses physical, mental and social well-being. Therefore, the outcome studies should focus on patient-derived data or assessment rather than the clinical outcomes. Put it in another way, what is more important? Are the results of a laboratory test and a physician assessment of symptom and sign more important than a patient's assessment of quality of life? Obviously, that is more important. How does it matter if a patient has normal liver function test but he feels terrible, or vice versa? So therefore, we need to understand that clinical outcome as assessed by surgeon and the quality of life as assessed by patient, they are two different entities. So when we talk of health-related quality of life, it means we need to measure the extent to which a procedure and disease process impacts the physical, psychological and social aspects of patient's life and feelings of well-being. There are a few scores which are available, and I would tell that they are generic as well as disease specific. The most commonly used is among the generic is SF-36, while psychosocial adjustment to illness is a supplement to SF-36. I'll go a little bit in detail about short form health survey of 36, which has 36 items from 8 domains, and these 8 domains are actually further subdivided into 4 dimensions, that is physical component score and mental component score. Among the disease specific quality of life scores, the time tested and validated score that we have is gastrointestinal quality of life index, which is GQLI. When we look at the literature on quality of life in biliary injury, we have rather disparate results, and the literature is not too much on this aspect of the biliary injury. So when we look at this, this is a seminal paper which came up in 2001 from Netherlands, from Borma's group. They looked for the first time comprehensively quality of life 5 years after the bile duct injury, and look what are the results. The results are that 94% of their patients had excellent clinical results. Please look at it. And when they applied this life SF-36 questionnaire, what they find is that long-term quality of life was remarkably poor on both physical and mental scales, and this they compared with uncomplicated laparoscopic cholecystectomy done 2 years ago, as well as the healthy Dutch population. And also they found that whether these patients were managed endoscopically or surgery, there was no difference in the quality of life of these patients. That means patients treated both endoscopically or surgically felt that they had poor quality of life in either case. This is a chart which shows a bar diagram where the dark bars are from the bile duct injury, and we see that the bile duct injury patients are consistently faring poorly in all the domains of SF-36, which is physical functioning, role functioning, general health, bodily pain, vitality, social functioning and mental health. Then after this, a study came from USA. This is from Nashville Vanderbilt, from Wright Pinson's group, who after looking at the Borma study tried to look at their results, which they felt 85% were excellent. And when they applied this questionnaire to their set of patients, they found that their patients also had lower scores on KPS as well as all components of SF-36. They did not find any health-related quality of life difference based on the duration of treatment, the level of injury or the type of repair. And also, as the duration of the post-operative period increased, there was no difference or no improvement of these quality of life scores. The Borma's group again presented this paper which was published in 2008 in endoscopy, where they did no longitudinal study, because the previous 2 studies were criticized that they were only 1 point contact with the patient, and based on that they have derived that the quality of life was poor. So they wanted to see whether there is any change in the quality of life over a period of time, and they found that there was no improvement over time, and also again they found that there was no difference with the type of injury, the type of treatment or the duration. More important thing which they found was that in patients who pursued malpractice litigation, the quality of life was definitely poor. There are some studies which were to the contrary also, and this is a study from Mayo Clinic by Fornell's group, and they found that at 8.4 years of follow-up, there was no difference in the mental and physical subscale. They were comparing this to the normal American population or northwestern region, and they concluded that surgical management is a single stop treatment for these bile duct injuries, which has excellent quality of life as well as clinical outcome. A similar study was also performed in Johns Hopkins. They also found that there were similar results as far as physical and social domains of quality of life are concerned. However, the mental quality of life, that is the psychological domain, scored significantly poorly in those patients, and the length of follow-up did not make any difference to the quality of life. Then came this meta-analysis in 2012, because there were different results in the literature on same set of patients in all these tertiary care centers claiming excellent results. And what they find is that the long-term detrimental effect on mental health related quality of life was there when they had this pool data of 870 patients in 6 of these studies. However, long-term physical health related quality was not significantly reduced after adjusting for follow-up time. So they said that the mental quality of life is poor in these patients who incur bile duct injury and repair, though the physical quality of life improves with passage of time. This study is the last I am going to quote here today, and this came last year, where the authors used 3 points of time, that is pre-operative, 1 year post-operative, and then 5 and 10 year post-operative. And they compared the quality of life scores of pre-operative stage to subsequent periods. And what they find is that comparing the 3 time points, there was significant improvement in the quality of life during the first year after surgery, though there was no further improvement at 1 and 5 years. At 5-year time point, these scores in all domains when compared to the normal population were subnormal. So why is this variation in the literature and in the long-term physical and mental health related quality of life? This may be probably because these different survey tools have been used. The follow-up time and the point of contact with the patient were different, and there are differences in the patient referral pattern and sampling. And also from the studies which I have seen and shown you here, some of these studies included patients who had been managed endoscopically. Almost 50% in Bournemouth group from Dutch, from Amsterdam, while from the Mayo Clinic as well as from the Johns Hopkins, predominant cases included were from the surgical modality. However, there are some facts which have been brought out by these studies that there is detriment in mental and or probably physical health related quality of life after bile duct injuries. And this persists even after you control a follow-up time that spans more than even a decade. These studies also tell us that there is no difference in the health related quality of life based on duration of treatment, level of injury or type of injury, type of treatment. So these studies do illustrate to us the importance of addressing both technical and patient-oriented outcomes. In addition, there are litigation issues in these patients, and the Western literature does show that there are 10 to 20% of these patients would file lawsuits at some point of their post-operative journey. And one of the reasons which have been ascribed for this filing of these lawsuits is a prolonged treatment course and additional intervention which these patients are subjected to, which lead to higher costs. However, patients who file lawsuit and who do not file suit, there could not be any, there were no parameters which could pick up that such and such patient would be filing lawsuits or not. But one thing was that those who filed lawsuit had definitely poor quality of life. So the question is, did the presence of a lawsuit led to a worse quality of life, or is the worst quality of life leading to a lawsuit? So it's a question of chicken or egg which cannot be answered. So what can be done actually to improve the health related quality of life score and to avoid lawsuits? So we have to understand that there are certain non-modifiable factors which lead to poor quality of life, which include prolonged recovery, disruption of lifestyle, loss of earning power, and it is not only for the patient but sometimes for the whole family. Large hospital bills are accrued. There are multiple diagnostic and therapeutic procedures which are often painful and disturbing for the patient. So all these factors we cannot do anything now once the injury has occurred. But what we can do is a careful communication with the patient about potential procedure-related complications and post-operative reports after the repair. It is the key actually that the people at tertiary care treat these patients. I reiterate here, treat these patients and the referring physicians with utmost respect and dignity. Patients, people taking care of these patients must be very careful about the comments that they made, and even in the halls or in the corridors, which can sometimes be heard by the patients or relatives, and specific instruction to be passed on to the house staff, the nursing staff, the ancillary personnel, to be circumspect in their conversation to these patients who are dealing with litigious issues. About the last slide, this is about the follow-up. The idea of the follow-up in these patients is to pick up restructuring at the earliest, and as Rajneesh has already said, one has to have intensive follow-up in the first 2 years. It can be 3 to 4 monthly, and then 6 monthly at 5 years, and subsequently it can be annual. It can go up to 10 years, 20 years, because the risk of restructure has been seen even there. So the follow-up protocol would mean that you pick up patient symptoms, do liver function tests, hepatic sonography, and liver biopsy, and MRI if any of these is normal. So the take-home messages from my talk would be the biliary injuries are here to stay. That we have seen over the last 2 decades. There is no reduction in the incidence of these injuries, which is probably inherent in the process of laparoscopic surgery. Both patient perception of quality of life and clinical outcome be measured, not in isolation but together, to assess actually the results of the repair of biliary injury. SF36 and GIQLI time tested scores and validated score, which should be employed in any assessment of the quality of life, and regular follow-up for at least 5 years is must. So I conclude by saying, this is a quote I put up from Gene Branham from Virginia, who said, "May it never be said by a patient who sues his surgeon that he did so because of what he heard from a medical student, a referral surgeon, or a nursing staff, implicitly or explicitly encouraging them to do so." Thank you.
With this, we are going to come to the end, and then he can give his comments in that. So all the talks given in this session are now open for questions and comments, and I would rather want that all the residents first pose their questions and queries before we let the senior people in the audience participate.
So we welcome questions from the residents first.
Yes.
They can ask questions.
So we have although
Questions
if we
from the senior persons.
go strictly by the time schedule on the scientific program printed and circulated to everybody, we are at the close end of this session. But we are going to take another extra 15 minutes and give you this time for discussion. So please do participate in this part of this is the most entertaining and enlightening part of the session, the discussion. Dr. Yadav, you want to start? Okay. Yeah.
And Dr. Rajesh especially highlighted everything. One thing had not been discussed, and that is very important, the patient perspective. And that is what this article by Strasberg mentions, and I had an opportunity to discuss with him. And he said he is participating in most of the litigation cases in USA as an expert. And what is his experience? So going towards them, the experience is that most of the people who went to the court, who are those? These are the people they were not explained properly about the injury. There was no proper mention of what has happened, and they were not referred at appropriate time to the appropriate person. So that was the most annoying thing, and everybody thought that something the patient or the concerned hid from them. So that is very, very important. And see, litigation, Rajesh, you covered the issue of litigation, but what is the cause of litigation? Because once patient has an injury, he has to be explained. We have to take it that, okay, this thing has happened, this is in the literature and this has happened, now I am taking care of you by referring to appropriate person. We should not be naming, but I know a person gets injury in Ludhiana, they refer to Mohali. What is fun of this particular referral? Mohali, not even Kotis. Another hospital in Mohali, somebody does something. So this particular insight has to come from the surgeon. Why we are blaming people that you don't discuss? Okay, you don't discuss. But what about the patient? So this is very, very important. I wanted to highlight this.
Now, I think not only Rajesh talked, but even Dr. Vinay Kapoor highlighted the litigation part in this. And I think I'll add my 2 bit to that, that it is again the lack of communication with the patient that is behind the root cause of all the litigations which occur. If you communicate properly with your patient at all spaces, so having a complication is not negligence. It is how you manage that complication where the negligence arises.
There was one in the.
If you do surgery, you will get complications, and complications are a part of surgery. So that is why it is the recognition of this fact that communication skills are very important and required, that the American residency program recognizes communication skills as one of the 6 core competencies which are to be taught to all surgical residents. So I think there is no doubt about this fact that communication is perhaps the most important thing in the prevention of litigation for all kinds of complications, not just bile duct injuries.
I've touched the litigation part. There's a splendid article in the Annals of Surgery, February 2010, by Bilal Al-Khafaf. He discussed the litigation part in detail, and National Health Services Litigation Authority data was given. The chances that the lawsuit will be admitted were the highest if the complainant had a biliary injury, right? And if there was a delay in diagnosis, there were almost 80% chances that the lawsuit will be decided in favor of the patient. And the amount of the compensation that was awarded in Great Britain, this is 2007-2008 data, was 1,03,000 Great Britain pounds, which is equivalent to approximately 1,80,000 US dollars. So you can well imagine that what amount of money goes into litigation and what amount of compensation is awarded. They also went ahead. Out of a 660 million, Great Britain pounds, which was spent in that period, approximately I think 25 or 30 million pounds were into the biliary duct injuries. The only pathology which went ahead of biliary duct injuries in getting a lawsuit decided in favor of the patient was a cautery burn. So you can well imagine when you say that bile duct injuries are here to stay, I don't think it is possible. It should not be like that. What are we doing for them? It's not inherent to the procedure. It's the education problem. The training of surgeons is deficient. That means when we accept and we surrender that the bile duct injuries are here to stay, they should not be here to stay. I think you've given us enough data of quality of life. Why do you have to say that they are here to stay? It should not.
He's made a very relevant point. What I'm saying is, I just put up one slide of litigation. My talk was on quality of life and follow-up, but I still put up one slide, but the whole discussion has been hijacked by that litigation slide.
We don't mind that.
No, I'm not. No, it's a discussion. I'm coming to the point, right? Which is the most important point, the litigation, and I didn't discuss the subset of patients who would go because there is no data which is available, right? So they have looked at the demography of the people, they have looked at the type of injuries, they have looked at the interventions, endoscopically managed surgery. So it's not possible to predict which patient will go for litigation and which will not. So I said, in my talk I would address the issue what we can do after it has occurred. So that is what I put up here. So coming to the question of the incidence of bile duct injury, which has remained stable over the past 2 decades. So this data which I set here or put up here was not from India, it is from West. Right? In the past 2 decades, they have seen consistently in all the reports, and the incidence is even 1.4%. So there are inherent problems with this procedure, and you know what are those problems. I don't need to spell out because that's not the domain here. They are there. We have to accept that. But what we can do is emphasize on the training part, emphasize on the certification, emphasize that if there is a difficulty, how to get out and wriggle out of this procedure. That I do not deny. But when I said it is stage, my idea was to be aware that they will occur. how to manage them, we should have to also learn about that aspect also. That's what I said.
Can I add to this? That, you know, the bile duct injuries not necessarily occurs with the beginners. It has happened in the best of hand. And there was one article which said that more bile duct injuries were seen after the first 200 cases. And
One third of the Bajaj
we
duct
cannot
injuries.
deny this thing, that it can be because of the all three factors. If we consider the anatomical part, the patient part, and the surgeon part, and it can be like ugly at any point of time. So about the litigation part, that I think
if we form a core group of surgeons
who say what has been said, कि if you have operated without caring, or you think this is a straightforward case, do not take proper precautions, you have injured the common bile. But if you take care for each and every patient as you will like your relation, you can avoid. But the incidence has gone up only because of the younger people who have not done even the open cholecystectomy, who do not know the ABCD of colored triangle dissection, who are very, say, I will do it in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, as if they are running a 100-meter race or something. That is the occasion when you are. If you are careful, if you are good about your communication, then, and also what has been very rightly said, your staff, people in the OT must have the proper ethics to talk outside the OT. Thank you.
in fact, they should not talk at all. The OT staff, including the residents, should be, in fact, whenever there is a complication in the ward, I think there should be a joint meeting conducted by the senior most surgeon and say that this is what has happened, and be careful in making any loose comment. And that single loose comment will create a big issue outside.
So I think we can take questions on something which is not related to litigation and related to biliary strictures now. Yes. So are there any? Yes. There's one person standing at the back. Yes.
Sir, if we do delayed repair of the hepatic strictures,
Who do you want to ask this question to?
Dr. Rajneesh.
Okay. Dr. Rajneesh.
Sir, if we do delayed repair
Yes, your
after
question,
3 months,
please,
after 3 months of injury, after some 4 months of injury, what will be the outcome of the hepaticojejunostomy, anastomosis, and next in follow-up?
You're saying we do it too late, is that?
Yes, suppose we are doing, patients came to us for after 4 months or 5 months.
Okay. So, two parts to that question. One is, fibrosis does start quite early. Documents say, articles say that people who studied this say that it starts around 3 months or so. Not to say that you should not do hepatitis after 3 months. Because I think, sorry, is right? You should read your science paper about reversal of fibrosis after hepatitis. And there is a proportion of patients where the fibrosis can and will reverse. The problem is, number one, you should not left it in 3 months. And number two, after 3 months, you should not deny the good risk patient hepatitis. You will probably never get the same results as a whole group as a patient who is operated at 6 weeks or 2 months. But it does not mean that you condemn the patient to a transplant.
What about that biliary injury is associated with some other vascular injury?
So I alluded to that very clearly, that if there is atrophy at 3 months, for example, best operation to do possibly today is the removal of the atrophic lobe and a hepatic stenostomy to the residual lobe, which is mostly the right lobe. But if there is no atrophy and you still document the arterial injury at 3 months, probably it's very well collateralized. You are not going to do a dissection. You are going to do a hepatic stenostomy only.
There's a question from this side. Please name the.
Dr. Nish, what opinion do you have regarding keeping brains of polycystic, keeping litigation in mind?
Okay. That's going to leave us. I think it's fairly well standardized that you don't need routine drains after laparoscopic cholecystectomy. I think I've been told by most experts sitting here, you can do it selectively in some groups of patients. The problem is that selective group is not well defined.
So I think we can take a poll from the sir. No. So there's nobody in the front row laying drains after polycystic. So not
That's
post-
optional.
one
The
comment
brain
from the
issue is settled, I think that depends on the case and the surgeon's preference.
I would just like to share one of the rare things that I had witnessed during my residency period. I was assisting, I have never said this thing outside, but now because in such a forum, I was assisting as a second assistant to Professor Santokh Singh Anand, and one of my senior, he was assisting at. Professor Santokh Singh Anand, who was supposed to be a very, very famous, eminent, bold surgeon, while doing a VIP, he just removed at least 2 centimeters of the common bile duct from both the ends. It was detected after the removal of the specimen. Of course, he said to me and to my other colleague, "Khote tusi ki kar rahe ho?" Why didn't you? But nothing doing. I must marvel his courage. From the specimen, he took out that end of the common bile duct, did anastomosis proximally and distally, put in a T-tube and came out. And that patient walked out on the 3rd or 4th day, and for years together the patient was coming for follow-up and nothing happened. I still do not know what happened. And the patient was a VIP. The patient was a real VIP and kept on following. I do not know how it happened. If anybody has got any bright idea, is it possible? We say that common bile duct has segmental blood supply, this and that, but I have seen it. I thought I will share this part of this.
I think around a month ago we had a children's club here, and I think the question was made by Gurpreet to me. I remember. We had a the club regarding the segment of the vessels which was repaired by the fascia, so the peritoneum. So even the segment of the vessel was repaired by the fascia containing the couple part of the probably the deep fascia, and they have done the experimental study. After experimental study, they have done actually the clinical patients with good success. So and ultimately, I think there was at that time I think the discussion was how this segment survived without any blood supply for some time. And it was only because of the lymphatic flow.
I think any more questions on biliary strictures?
There is one question from the back.
Yes, there are. I see some hands. Yes, there
During
is.
my residency period, I used to make a tube of the peritoneum in experimental animal to replace the common bile duct. But the peritoneum doesn't have any
We need
musculature.
questions on bile duct strictures, please. Yes. Yes, there. Please stand up and ask your question.
What is there?
Please ask. Okay, Rahul. Yes.
Sir, do we need to do a CT angio formally before planning any biliary?
Your question is addressed to which speaker?
Dr.
Dr. Rajneesh, you are in demand. Please stay up front, please. This is the disadvantage of giving 2 talks.
Second one was thrust on me.
Sir, do we need to do angiography, CT angio before any repair? Because it will maybe contribute to the prognostication, but does it change the operative plan?
Let me answer the question this way. There is no straight answer to the question. If you are doing a repair which is second repair, for example, you are operating a strictured hepatic genostomy, you should do a CT angiography. Number one. If you are trying to repair the bile duct at 3 days after a major bile duct injury, it is wise to do a CT angio to check, or whichever other form of injury you want to do, to check that the right artery is intact. Right? Again, not evidence based.
So
Based on personal advice by
does that satisfy you, Rahul?
Can I complete that? So that leaves us the middle segment, which means what do you do when the patient who comes to you for a repair between 6 weeks to 3 months, primary repair or primary hepatic genostomy? Question is completely unsettled. There are units who do routine angiography, the units who do not. The only difference between the 2 units is the cost of the angiogram. Because it really does make any difference to what you do at the first anastomosis. Your anastomosis is going to be the same. And we also know that artery injury cannot directly predict as a 100% predictor of failure of hepatic investment. So for that reason, most units adopt a selective policy in between. As far as the earlier and the later goes, I made very clear that you need angiography in those two scenarios.
We have one last question from Dr. Ishita. Yes. Ishita, this is the last question. Everybody else can ask their questions during tea. After this question, we break for tea.
So what would be the optimal time for doing an MRCP after a biliary injury detected in the immediate post-op period?
Good question. Excellent question actually. Just to complement your question, I've seen MRCP has been done at 2 days after a bilateral injury because the primary surgeon was really anxious to find out what is going on. The result was a thin streak of bile in the bile duct overlapped by the duodenum and a lot of bile sitting in the hepatic in the Morrison's pouch, and the surgeon never came to know what is actually wrong with the patient. Right?
No more questions, please. No more. It still takes time, Virender. It still takes time.
Yeah. So it is all right to say you need a cholangiogram, but it is important to choose your timing. That is why I made it very clear in my first presentation that the first priority is good drainage. That is actually for the patient, but also buys you a little time to clear that area of fluid and make sure that there is fluid present only in the delivery system, so the MRCP actually shows you something. I think his point is going to be, let me preempt your answer, that it's a dynamic imaging. And I fully agree. ERCP is a dynamic imaging, so that's far better in a patient who is going to do an imaging or a cholangiogram on the second day or the third day. Because I agree, MRCP on the second or third day is going to show you nothing. It's going to be terrible. But things are changing. I think the radiologists, if you hear this talk very carefully, we have a dynamic MR coming in very rapidly. Unfortunately, the contrast is still not licensed in this country. It's freely available elsewhere.
Very good afternoon, friends. It's my proud privilege and invite our esteemed teacher, Professor S.P. Kaushik, who has been one of the pioneers in establishing the surgical gastroenterology in India. And you can see how many students he has to his credit, not only in India but in abroad also. And all of us are his disciples, working here and there and trying to replicate what he taught as a principle of surgery. One thing I would like to share, and he was telling once on the round that once he was presenting a data of biliary injury in UK, and somebody in the UK said that why your injury is so much more than in any other center in the UK. So he said, this is what it is. I cannot hide it. So that is how we learned that we should have a honest data. We should have a one unit where everybody should be coming and taking rounds together, and we should learn to work as a group practice. And for me, probably I am sitting here because he took me here in Chandigarh from this thing. Okay, sir. So he's not allowing me to say something. So your time has not started. So, sir, I request you to deliver your talk on training in GI surgery. You have been very active in learning and academics and teaching, and I invite you to start your talk.
Friends, colleagues, and young surgeons, I feel emotional, I feel honored, and I feel delighted to address you this afternoon on a subject which has been very dear to my heart. As a matter of fact, since morning, the CME is also part of it. And every speaker has tried to train you in some way or other how you could become a better surgeon than what you are. silly, like also is part of the training, and there may be certain amount what you may consider as feminine. But whatsoever is being said, I think is important. You should listen, and you should try and follow that to become a better servant. Well, you heard our Prime Minister say so many times, and this seems to be a government policy today anyway, that skill development is important in a priority. And therefore, it is important for all of you also to be better self, develop better skills than otherwise. It might be interesting to know that there is an acute shortage of specialist doctors in the country as compared to the rest of the world. The current ratio in India is one specialist doctor per 10,000 patients, which ought to be 1 to 1,000 patients. This slide indicates, and this all indicates, the popularity of surgical gastroenterology and the surgical discipline today. It has made phenomenal progress, no denying, in the last 3 decades. The progress of the nature which even I thought personally of my own self as an individual, I would be telling you a lie if I say that I had foreseen this much of development. I mean, it has gone beyond my own expectations, what surgical gastroenterology has become today, and that of course HPV is a step ahead. And it has further developed into not only HPV surgery, liver transplantation, and so many other branches of service specialization. I am your past. You are my present. And I think both of us together have to look at our future 10 years, 15 years ahead. And if we have to look at our future 10, 15 years ahead, we have to train ourselves better. We have to perform much better than what we are doing now, with the infrastructure and facilities which the onus is on the provider. I'm going back. There are a number of high volume centers today, and there is no shortage of training facilities, although I'm sure the number should be much more. Many exclusive setups of hepatobiliary surgery also are there in the country, and some of the liver transplant centers are exclusively doing transplant. The concept of high volume has not only improved skills and better results and treatment, lowered morbidity, it has also provided better palliation and cure rates to the suffering community. There are centers with MCH, DNB and fellowship for certificate courses extending from few months fellowship to 3 years residency programs. There are CMEs and there are other ways and means which can serve your purpose of getting little better exposure and become a better surgeon. I think one of the reasons I have not been getting up and making comments, because whatsoever was being said from morning, I thought my lecture or my talk has already been finished by the speaker so far. And no doubt about it that the most important factor to determine the outcome of any surgical procedure is the surgeon himself or herself. This has been proven by various studies, this has been mentioned by various associations and group of people that the single most determining factor regarding the outcome of the procedure is the surgeon himself. And therefore you have to be a better surgeon. You cannot afford to be a mediocre person. You have to be a better surgeon if you want to do better surgery and be faithful to the career you have chosen. But the surgeon's responsibility does not finish by operating alone. Complications. So much has been talked about complications since morning. Complications do occur. Complication, it happens to the bishop. When I was in UK, my teacher would say, well, this happens to the bishop. I mean, bishop there is the person who is a religious head. And he sort of works in the church and he is supposed to be no sins. But it happens. It will happen to anybody and everybody. Anybody who says no complication is telling you. But it is not the happening of the complication. It is how you handle the complication which is important. It is the ability of successfully deal with major post-operative complication which is the hallmark of good training and background. And this is where it is important to have a good exposure and good training. No denying there is a rising graph of complications. We are seeing more and more of them, and the reasons are well known. Spider use, certain amount of surgical adventurism, which I'm sure you would not deny, inadequate training background and infrastructure, and lack of team approach. Unfortunately, we do not have enough data to tell us what happens to these patients who run into complications, which I think is something I look forward to in the near future. When we talk of statistics about complications and somebody projected 5%, 2%, 3%, 1.5%, it's really unimportant from the patient's point of view. For your patient who is an individual, it is 100% yes or 100% no. So think of the patient point of view. Your having मैं तो 4 मरीज ठीक हो जाते हैं 5 बार खराब होता है. It is not for the patient, and therefore do not undertake any surgery on any patient thinking that there may or may not be a complication. Your effort should be zero complication. Recognition and prompt treatment is mandatory. It has not only personal, financial, social, and all kinds of implications. And therefore, the importance of training. Now, there are 3 or 4 compartments of the training program. One is the trainee, the other is the trainer, your teacher, your institution or the department or the setup where you are undergoing training. Everything is important and has to be covered. And everybody has to live. The responsibility lies on all these. These are the pillars. The training program, anybody who is planning a training program, the program has to be structured and fully implemented. You cannot be light-minded or light-hearted about a training program. No. Faculty participation is a must and compulsory. It's my class. I may go 15 minutes late or 10 minutes late, doesn't work. I think the entire faculty, to my mind, ought to be present in all teaching sessions. Ratio of teachers and tots must be ensured, and greater emphasis needs to be placed on clinical problem solving. I know the amount of development, MRs and dynamic MRs and MGO and whatnot, is all very good. Is all technical advances are bound to be there, should be there, must be there, and must be made use of. But don't forget, you are the important individual who has to make. If you say, okay, I can't make the diagnosis, MR would make the diagnosis, but the decision to do MR would be whose? That would be yours. So unless you can think of getting an MR done, MR would not, machine would not walk to the patient and do the MR. And therefore, I think it is important for you to sharpen your clinical background and acumen. Is the training in HPV surgery synonymous with the training in other surgical disciplines? A question which can be asked. They are both answers, yes and no. Because all surgery technically involves what? You expose by making an incision, you expose a structure, you identify a structure, you cut a structure and you join it. These are the 4 steps of surgery, and any operation can be done so that HPV can also be done. But no, it's the special nature and composition of that distribution. Think of a patient who has a duodenal patient. Think of a patient who has undergone visceral and parenteral leaking. So it's the special nature and composition of that distribution. The very anatomical configuration of hepatobiliary system, which speaker after speaker has emphasized since morning, it creates a very difficult and different clinical challenge for the surgeon. And you have to live to this. Otherwise, do something else. A 3 years full-time training period would be desired. I say desirable because I do realize MBBS, MS, MCH, further 3 years training. I think it is very unfair to medical practitioners that long training period is there. But then as a surgeon or as a clinician or as a teacher or as a surgeon, you are learning all your life. I picked up a lot of new things today from this CME. And I think this learning exercise never stops. Shorter periods could be there after MCH or such special experience after your MS if MCH is not there. But the important thing is hands-on experience. A surgeon who has not had hands-on experience may watch many procedures, not be confident enough to do it himself unless he or she has been trained and had hands-on experience under supervision. And therefore, graded exposure from observation to assistance, from assistance to doing procedures under supervision, and then doing procedure independently is absolutely essential as far as the training program is concerned. Short periods of postings to related specialties are a must. You cannot do without good knowledge of basic sciences. Japanese surgeons, I know, who do their own cholangiography, would interpret their own cholangiographic pictures or CT or MR or any special investigations, and would do their own endoscopies. Why as a surgeon? Somebody else should do an endoscopy and I should believe his findings or I should go according to his advice. Because it is my own perception as a surgeon, and I made it compulsory therefore at Sanjay Gandhi PGI that all MCH or no MCH residents in the department would have posting to endoscopy as well as to radiology. define formulated course curriculum for the training period. It is 3 months or it is 6 months or it is 1 year or 3 years. It must be revisited and revised every 5 years. Prioritization relevant to the needs of society ought to be done, and therefore you must define your thrust areas relevant to local epidemiology. Carcinoma, gallbladder, gallstone, peptic ulcer, to a part of history, I suppose. But there would be some local diseases which would be much more prevalent, and you need to take care of them. The syllabus must include medical ethics and development of communication and management skills. This is what everybody was talking about. Litigation, no litigation, communication with the patient. I think it should be part of your training. It should be discussed on the floor, in the classes, in your training period, how you should interact with the patient, what medical ethics should you follow, and how should you communicate. Sub-specialization must be encouraged, otherwise we won't be here where we are today. I was initially in the morning, some of the lectures, I was little uneasy when everybody was talking of and quoting long studies and literature from the Western countries. A country like India, I think no country would have more clinical material than what is present in your country. I think Ramesh mentioned 9,000 cholecystectomy lab colleagues. Imagine 9,000 lab colleagues from a single center in last, say, 5 years, 10 years, okay. Multiply it by centers all over the country. How many cholecystectomies? And why can't we have our own data and statistics to quote here and show on the screen that look, out of the so many million cholecystectomies done in India, this is what the statistics are. And I think this is, when I say I and you together are looking 10 years ahead, I hope 10 years from hence, I may not be there, but this data should come. And to do that, if you are going to do that, you have to have logbooks. You have to collect your data. And it must be made mandatory. No training center should allow a person to talk in the air. There must be backup of data to support any statement which you want to make. You must audit your results. An Australian surgeon, I think visiting Sandegani PGI once, said two things. He said, I think it was I who said about esophageal resection, and I said, look, I thought I'll get away with the anastomosis, I did it to the chest. And he stopped me, he said, only these get away. Surgeons don't get away. So there's no question of, I thought I will get away. I said, yes, I agree with you, and I'm sorry. Second thing he said, I keep a red file. And red file is those cases of mine which I have unfortunately not been able to successfully treat or have spoiled. So I keep a summary of that case in my red file to keep reminding me that look, this is where I have gone wrong. So you must audit your results. Not only your results, you must audit the results of your team and the department, and you must critically analyze and scrutinize those results, that where have you gone wrong and how could you do better tomorrow. incorporation of IT-based technologies, of course, is totally different. At university, I used to punch computer cards. I don't think you would have heard or seen computer cards. In those days, there was cards, yellow cards like this, and at multiple 84 punched holes, you had to, sort of, according to what you want to put on the computer, you had to feed them. But again, you have to be honest about that. The other thing which I think is very disappointing is the scientific research in this country. So much of clinical material. What is our contribution to scientific research? And I think this again is important, and we ought to promote scientific research. Laboratory work, project identification and allocation, every one of you must be given or assigned something or other. Nothing else, 10 cases of polycystic. Let me know the analysis of 10 cases. At least you know how to do it. I know thesis dissertations are faster and faster, but how many of us really seriously take them up? Conference presentations by youngsters, young surgeons, and publications must be made compulsory. Interdepartmental, interinstitutional collaborations and networking needs to be encouraged, and this goes with the point I made a little earlier, that 10-year hence, if I live, I would like to see the data projection from 50 Indian centers having done 9,000 cholecystectomies each, rather than quote somebody else from BJS or from GUT. No denying, without infrastructure support and equipment and other facilities, you won't be able to train better people, you won't get trained yourself. But at the same time, I think working together, healthy work culture would make a tremendous difference also. The onus lies, here it says providers, I would say on all of us. Let us say what a trainee should be. I mean, you're not casually walking into a shop and doing all shopping around and going back home. You must have been married. You must have an aptitude and full commitment to learn. I come here to learn. Believe me, these 3 years of your life are never going to come back again. They're gone. If you don't make use of them, the balance is zero. So it's up to you. Take the horse to the well. But he has to drink the water himself. And as a trainee, you ought to realize this, and you ought to make this effort that yes, I come here to train myself, and I must train myself well. I will not miss any opportunity to be trained. And therefore, sincere and honest working during training period would reflect in your future career. If you have done it, you would be a good surgeon tomorrow. If you have not done it, you will be a shopkeeper. The trainer, as I said, there are different compartments of this entire exercise. Must acquire qualities to train. The onus is on him. I can't be a trainer unless I have the qualities to train. I must train a trainee well. I'm not in direct or indirect competition or conflict with the trainee. As a matter of fact, it works to my positivity rather than negativity. I need to give more and expect little in return. Self-interest, unfortunately, some of us do not get above it, and which is very bad. And we have to follow ethics, both of personal and professional conduct, if we are trained. We must not let anybody raise a finger and say, look, that's what he has done. Should not have been done. Then only will set an example. As a teacher, you ought to be well read and prepared. I do not talk about college system now because I haven't read about college system for the last 15 years, so I don't know about the latest literature. But if I want to teach, I have to. Must continue to update knowledge, you have to be up to date. Keep to the time and schedule, fulfilling all teaching responsibilities and be accountable. And I think the student feedback is a very important practice which must be introduced in all institutions. I'm just finishing reading now. Look what the President of India said in Punjab University in March 2015. And I quote what he said, to make learning more effective, teaching pedagogy must be defined, curricula upgraded, an interdisciplinary approach adopted, and evaluation mechanism reformed. Have I said anything different? I mean, look at the top man in the country is telling you that. Please follow him. Ladies and gentlemen, the joy of teaching and training is in the quality of product you teach and train. When I look around, I honestly feel very proud to see what all they have done and where they have all reached. Be it Sadiq, be it TD, be it Sarkari, I mean, I cannot think of any resident who has let me down. The trainee ought to be better than the trainer, and this is what I firmly believe. My personal wish is that there is no greater pleasure in life than to be a teacher and trainer, and I wish I could have trained more people. Please do not tolerate mediocrity. Ensure quality of product, and the challenge lies with you. Thank you very much.